Welcome back to Conversations with the Leaky Cauldron, episode 26, Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, chapters 26 through 30. Back with me, as usual, are my two esteemed colleagues, Miss Sarah Miller and Mr. Wesley Schantz. Welcome back.
Hey, how's it going?
It's going well.
Welcome back.
Happy birthday. Thank you for welcoming me back, and happy birthday, Wes. It is July 30th. And so, as we were talking about in the pre-show, your birthday, possibly J.K. Rowling's birthday, certainly Neville and Harry's birthday. Happy birthday.
Thanks. Yes, it's an honor to be sharing this birthday with such a great hero as Neville, and Harry's also is a very esteemed colleague of ours. So yeah, it's a fun set of chapters to be looking at with this, as well as they're sort of coming up to another huge milestone in these sort of years of Hogwarts, right? This is the culmination of all of those. So it's exciting stuff.
Yes, it reminded me very much of the Roman god Janus, from whom we get the month January, a door opening and closing in one way, a beginning and an end. And so interesting that we started this project last year and we were so close to the beginning, and now we find ourselves two podcasts away from the end. And so one thing ending, another thing coming to be, reminds me very much of like a snake shedding its skin, or a circular snake like the Ouroboros. But speaking of more present snakes and Nagini and things that we have learned, well, actually, we should go back to the past, because in the pre-show, what we were talking about were not just chapters 26 through 30, but also chapter 25. And Sarah, you had brought up a couple issues that you thought we hadn't really given attention to yet, and that maybe we might found our conversation on those. So would you mind illustrating those, and maybe we can go from there?
Sure. Chapter 25 is titled Shell Cottage, and it follows chapter 24, where we see Harry and Ron and Hermione. Harry buries Dobby, which is a terribly sad moment. And then he makes a choice to interview Griphook, who they save from Malfoy Manor first, and then to interview Ollivander, which sort of is supposed to represent him making the choice to go after the Horcruxes and not to remain in search of the Hallows. There's a lot we learn about like the geopolitics and geopolitical history of, wizards and goblins. There's a lot we learn about that from Griphook. There's a lot we learn about wand lore from Ollivander. But in chapter 25, I think there are a couple moments where on the one hand, the chapter, I think, kind of serves as a bit plot filler. Like they pass quite a bit of time at Shell Cottage and they prepare for their next adventure. But the beginning of the chapter, this is in my book, it's page 502. Harry's still reflecting upon his decision not to go after the Elder Wand, which basically Ollivander has confirmed exists. And it says, the enormity of his decision not to race Voldemort to the wand still scared Harry. He could not remember ever before choosing not to act. He was full of doubts. And Ron, and they have kind of this, these couple pages where they start to wonder, like, have we misread all of the signs? Were we just too slow to figure things out? And I think that's interesting, right? That he makes what is effectively a split-second decision and second guesses it, and I think it sort of gets at some of the things we've been talking about that yield wisdom. Like, is it knowledge? Is it experience? Is it some combination of those things that like fashions or shapes instinct? And when do you trust it and when do you not? Later in that chapter is also when Lupin arrives and announces that Tonks is pregnant. And you have another one of those moments where there's like a little bit of levity, like just this, they experience this enormous amount of joy, kind of like when they were listening to the radio broadcast, where they forget for a moment all the shit that's happening. Anyway, those are the two things that I thought were important.
I mean, the second one, not just that she's pregnant, right, but she's given birth.
Oh yeah, that's right.
They've had the kid, and Harry is named Godfather, which is it makes him stand in the place then of Sirius Black to him, which he thinks about a little bit there at the very tail end of that chapter. So I thought that was kind of, that sort of rite of passage thing being hit there as well.
Yeah, and also, I mean, to that point, I think it will be made even more explicit by the end of the text, that parallel, or even stronger, a parallel. But I was interested in something you also brought up in the pre-show, Sarah, the idea that Bill brings up about the differences between goblin ideas of proportionality and agreement in terms of business deals and wizard ones. Because frankly, when the concept was first given to me, I didn't exactly understand what was being suggested. And, frankly, the whole situation reminded me a little bit of The Merchant of Venice by Shakespeare, and the sort of like what Shylock wants, as opposed to, I forget the name of the character who's negotiating with him for a pound of flesh. Rodrigo or something like that. I can't.
Antonio, maybe.
Antonio, yes, that very good. And so I was just, what do you think the differences in ideas of proportionality are between goblins and wizards? What do you think about the whole goblin and wizard dynamic and the differing histories and the differing ideas that how history is told depends on who is telling it, and thus the questions that raises about the merit of the stories one is told and the truth of them. And did you have any idea? I might have already asked this in one way or another, but did you have any idea how Griphook's idea of, I guess, justice or fairness would differ from, say, a more conventional idea? Our idea, if we even know what that is?
Well, I don't, I think Bill explains things in the chapter Shell Cottage. I'm pretty sure Hermione has known for a while, because she actually did the reading and listened to the lectures in History of Magic, and she talks about it in chapter 24 as well. Just before they speak to Griphook, I think, or maybe I'm just getting all kinds of confused, but just that, there's wrongdoing on all sides. I think Griphook is particularly, I don't know, impressed is the wrong word. He frightens Harry a little bit when he acknowledges a couple times that that you buried the elf without magic. And in the movie, that's meant to make Harry look noble in the eyes of Griphook. But I think when I read this time, I think I recognized how foreign they are to the cultures are to one another. And when Bill describes their theory of property, I thought that was really interesting. I think it sets Harry up to look exactly the opposite of, his worldview is the exact opposite of the fountain in the Ministry of Magic, with the wizards on top of all of the other creatures. That is well described earlier in the book. But at the end of chapter, I think it's chapter 25, when Bill says that like that goblins don't believe in like inheritance of goblin property by wizard owners, that like if a wizard purchased something from a goblin, then they basically rented it, and that to a goblin, the owner is the maker. That seems like fundamentally different than the wizard view of property. Not like, and so it seems like in this, I don't know. I'm trying to tie it to Harry becoming a godfather, which is, you know, like you said, Wes, definitely a rite of passage, definitely a moment where you are not a child but an adult. That like, you know, there are divisions and impasses that like no amount of, you know, holding hands and singing songs is going to overcome. Like that's just a really fundamental difference in entry point. I don't know if that's even really answering your question.
Well, I mean, the question of ownership is, I think, pretty interesting the way that it arises here, because this object then has a kind of collective ownership, like the goblins own it. Like it's not really clear that like whichever particular goblin made it is even still alive at all, but that like because a goblin made it, it belongs to some goblin somewhere, right? Mm-hmm. I thought that was kind of a strange like insight maybe into their sort of idea of ownership as this kind of collective thing, that it relates to their, you know, their pride and their skill at crafting and making, and you know, the kind of disconnect there because they don't know how to make wands. That seems to be like a really big difference, I guess, between goblins and wizards. It's like the wizards have never shared that knowledge with goblins, and so goblins, as a result, or like, you know, just in tit for tat kind of thing, thus like are not really trusting of wizards either. So there's this kind of, you know, this collective element to it, this power dynamic there. I thought about, you know, with Griphook sort of not fully trusting them. He seems to know that Harry is going to try to trick him, right? And as much as Bill tries to warn Harry, and you know, there's really nothing he can do about it, right? He's made his deal, and sure enough, Griphook gets, you know, comes out on top when the final denouement comes on this river of burning gold, right? Which is a great scene that I'm sure we'll look at here in a minute. But there's something really interesting about this kind of partial trust, but then ultimate double cross. Like no way was this going to turn out with all parties sort of like understanding one another, but they just kind of have to muddle through because they've got this kind of bigger problem here. And I thought that was something that the little Lupin interlude, the Godfather thing, just kind of helps, like, again, like pull back the perspective a little bit and be like, it reminds me of the wedding scene way earlier, where it's like, oh, there's all these other things that, you know, happen in people's lives, that this great kind of conflict and crisis is ultimately sort of a passing thing, but has to be sort of dealt with before you can get back to all that more pleasant sort of stuff.
Yeah, it's really interesting, and just as you said, the ideas of ownership, the one idea, the goblin idea, that whichever race of people, a more collective idea, right, produced an object, owns that object because ostensibly they have the greatest possible knowledge of it because it came from them. And then opposed to that is the wizarding idea, which is if you produce, you know, the money, or, you know, whatever is symbolic of money necessary, the galleons necessary to take an object, then that's good enough, though you might not understand it quite as well. It reminds me some of the parable of the vines, and, you know, how there are some vines that are old and some vines that are new, but they're all part of the same tree. I wonder if there's not only a political difference between the goblins and the wizards, but sort of a religious difference too. And I wonder whether that has a parallel in the primary world as well. Because it's interesting, because there are potentially some interesting elements coming out in Rowling's writing here, especially given, say, like the name of Grip Hook, grab, and the profession as a banker dealing with money and more ancient magic than the wizarding people understand. I think that's fairly suggestive and interesting.
I don't know that there's much that I can speak to about that, like the comparison with Shylock or the subtext that you're reading into it. I just don't feel like I have a whole lot to say about that.
Sure. I guess my question is just to what extent it's a question that of course we can pass over. To what extent do the thoughts of the author bleed out from them into their secondary world and affect how they portray symbolic relationships between peoples? And to what extent can somebody just, sort of autochthonically generate new relationships between people that are completely unique and are in no way based in contrast or in comparison to those that they know? I don't know. Maybe not an interesting question. Maybe we want to focus on the Ocean's 11 sort of breaking in to the Great Green Gods instead, and the meeting of the blind dragon and the riding on the back of him, because definitely we have some action in this, as we mentioned earlier.
Yeah, for sure. And we can't forget about Aberforth or all the things. I mean, like, a lot happened. So I think maybe in the interest of time, we talk about, ideas and questions and reactions to the next chronological piece, which is the invasion. What do you guys think? What should we attend to?
Yeah, I think we should stick more to the story here.
Well, then, Aberforth, what did we think about meeting this old goat?
That's funny. Because literally, his patronus is a goat. Was that intentional? I don't know. If that was not intentional, that's very clever. Yeah, I thought he was an important character, and it wove some really good humanizing story or perspective on Dumbledore for me. I remember the first time reading this story, obviously, over a decade ago. I remember feeling like we finally got the answer to the pieces of the puzzle that were missing for a long time. And I like the way that Aberforth weeps at the discussion of the death of his sister, I think is really moving. But then the way that Harry kind of pieces together what happened on Dumbledore's last night and how that was actually all about his brother and his sister and not about something bigger, but that yet there would be nothing bigger, I guess. And that was the lesson maybe he needed to learn. I thought that was just, to me, masterful storytelling. And I think watching him be kind of combative with another adult who looks like Dumbledore is probably pretty cathartic for him because he's so angry with Dumbledore, but also maybe an indication that he's sort of coming into his own. Yeah, what did you guys think?
I guess I couldn't remember where the blue eye came in for a long time, but then as they started making more references to Dumbledore's family, I sort of got this vague recollection that his brother was still out there somewhere. And I think it's, pretty impressive that J.K. Rowling, has Aberforth there the whole time as the bartender of the Hog's Head, right? This bar that I guess comes into the story in the third book, maybe, when they're like exploring Hogsmeade for the first time, or maybe it's mentioned even before that, but like just an incredible bit of plotting, like to just keep that in her back pocket all along, and then sort of bring him out here at this critical turning point, which it's really well woven in with the stories about Dumbledore that we've also been getting hints about, mostly in this book, but and at the end of that sixth book where he's drinking the potion, we can only sort of guess at what that might be about. I think as much as his feeling of guilt is a part of that, I think it's also his friendship with Grindelwald, and seeing that he's like being betrayed in that moment, or being at least let down, right, by Grindelwald revealing sort of his true colors. And so having to relive that aspect of it has got to be at least a part of that kind of anguish that he's undergoing in the cave. And I think it's really unsettling how that is then mirrored by Voldemort's reaction of like rage and fear when he realizes, they stole just a cup. They must know, right, about his Horcruxes. And so this sense of like the thing that you trusted having betrayed you, it sort of passes, it jumps from Harry with Dumbledore, sort of letting him down, Aberforth, rather the memory that we get from Aberforth about when Dumbledore's best friend Grindelwald lets him down, and now also with Voldemort of all people sort of being terrified, right, that his secret is out.
Right. Several interesting things about Aberforth are that his Patronus is a goat, whereas Albus's is a phoenix. His is very much grounded and stubborn, as if he is sort of like the willpower or to the intellect of Albus Dumbledore. Though he does look a lot like Dumbledore in the same way that Harry looks a lot like James. He also very interestingly is willing to lie for Harry immediately upon meeting him, and then even reveals the great family lie that both Albus and he were privy to about their poor disordered sister, their sister who had magic within her but could not control it because of tremendous abuse at the hands of local boys when she was young. I think what he does a good job of shows the complexity of the relationships that people find themselves found within. Albus has a relationship with Aberforth of filial bond, and then sort of a protective bond of his younger sister, and then also sort of a connection and bond to their dead mother and father now to take care of the family, to be head of the family, as Aberforth says, with ostensibly scare quotes. I think he scoffs at that when he says it. But also a relationship with Grindelwald, a very similarly talented young person, as well as Dumbledore's relations with the leading wizards of the age. It seems as if we had this one-dimensional representation of him as this ultimate headmaster, sort of Gandalf-like divinity figure. And now we're seeing him in much more human terms, as we also notice differing accounts of him. So like something we brought up earlier that, we have this goblin history as well as the history from Professor Binns, a wizard. And so because of the differing natures of those history, there are epistemological questions that come up. Well, the same thing is happening with Dumbledore too, right? We have a Rita Skeeter account who doesn't seem to like him that much, and we can see why. But there are also doting accounts that Aberforth mentions. In fact, himself claiming that there's potentially a prejudice with Harry and Hermione and Ron, and then he does something that I consider sort of nasty, but maybe also liberating. He brings doubt back into the equation. He says, well, you don't have to do anything that Albus told you to do. He's dead, and people get hurt when they follow his schemes, as he derisively calls them. And so I guess I wanted to mention several things that I thought were interesting, but also ask you about the fact that he tries to play the role of liberator between Harry, the group, and the task.
Sorry,
Yeah,
Alex,
I thought that
what
was
was your
interesting.
question?
Did I miss something?
Yeah, I just wasn't sure what the question was. Like, what do we make of him attempting to free Harry of some sort of duty that he feels he's bound to?
Yeah, what do you think of him coming in from that slant? Not supportive, but rather dismissive of the responsibility that Dumbledore gave to Harry and the three in total.
In there, I was just gonna say, like, I thought it was very quickly like turned into him helping them, complete their task essentially. Like, although that is like raised, and maybe that's even the thing that he really does believe is best for them to do, just to leave and hide and get out. It's like he then turns to the painting of his sister of all things, and like sort of gives her the nod. And then, the true hero of the series finally reappears on the page, Neville, who's like bedraggled and just like overjoyed at seeing Harry back. So it's like it's like this kind of last temptation of Christ kind of moment, right? Like you can leave everything, you can just go and try to be safe somewhere. But it's I think, very quickly just turns into, okay, this is like the big end of the series that we're about to see. They're back at Hogwarts finally after 600 pages. Normally it only takes like 100 or 2 for them to get back to Hogwarts at the start of a book. This time it took them 600, but they got there. And so finally we're going to see, what we've been waiting for.
Yeah, I mean, I think the fact that they look so similar, I think that provides, narratively, I think it provides Harry the chance to, when Aberforth presents well, you could just quit and like run away and hide yourself, and oh, by the way, you have to hide these other 2 people because they'll never live safely in this new regime because they're known to be working with you. What he I think presents them with is, at least visually, it's a chance for Harry to instead like actively take on something that he felt he was shouldered with for quite some time, right? Like instead of oh well, Dumbledore gave me a task to do, he visually leans into it, I think, by reacting to the challenge posed by someone who looks just like Dumbledore. I don't know if that makes any sense, but I'd like, from a theatric perspective, I think it has that kind of visual effect. But I'm struck by how much Aberforth claims to have like given up, right? And yet he doesn't turn in Harry, and he at great cost to himself welcomes them in, and then challenges the other Death Eaters to he lies about the Patronus at great risk, and it's almost as though I don't know how much he believes what he is saying about, the Order of the Phoenix is finished. It's all over. My brother often gave tasks to people without regard to what it would do to them. I think, I guess the swiftness with which Aberforth is almost instinctive in defending Harry, Ron, and Hermione, as well as how quickly he allows them to continue through his pub. He just seems rather like cantankerous and not actually believing. He's not actually the figure who is so disillusioned that he is, that he's given up completely. And, in that sense, maybe he is the last test. But I think for me, the thing that the character also presents is that there are like we've been saying, that there are different side. There are so many sides to one story, right? And that sometimes in school we learn one side. You learn like the wizard history, but you don't learn the goblin version of it. Or for a really long time, like Draco Malfoy is this like terrible villain of a boy. And then all of a sudden it starts to become increasingly less black and white. And then, we're almost at the point where we kind of pity him, or maybe he even is trying to do the right thing as best as he can. And maybe for selfish reasons, but, I think the story of Albus and Aberforth and Ariana and Kendra and their dad, the name of whom is escaping me, but that whole story just reminds me that like people have a context in which they operate, and that context is individual and psychological as well as cultural, right? And they operate within that context. And I think it's really easy to judge when we don't know context. And it's really easy to reduce people to say like their accomplishments or to their wand or, to the house that they belong into or to the class that they come from or whatever, but not really get to know their context. And for me, like Aberforth and Albus, to me, that's just like a really interesting commentary on the ways that different contexts or different characters might define greatness differently, right? Like, just because we've loved Albus Dumbledore doesn't mean that, like, Aberforth is wrong. I mean, he was a better sibling than Albus was. He would have been a better caretaker of their sister than the young boy Albus Dumbledore was, right? His Patronus is a goat, but there's nothing wrong with goats, right? Like, there's nothing wrong with never contributing to transfiguration today or like coming up with some magical alchemical formula. Like, what if greatness can also include like running a bar, right? You know what I mean? Like,
Absolutely.
I think that's sort of what I got out of that, is that like there's no such thing as one way to be good. Goodness may always, I don't know if that makes any sense, but yeah.
Well, I just really like that, the way that Albus and Aberforth are juxtaposed here is then like immediately you then get Harry and Neville juxtaposed, through this secret passageway, and they've been, doing like their good heroic deeds, each on their own. Neville, of course, working within the school, and and the expectations that still, right, although they both have the same ultimate goal because of their different, ambits that they're working within, right, the fields that they're plowing or whatever, they have a really different idea about like what to do in this moment. And Neville's expectations and all the kids in the school is really different from, of course, what like Harry, Ron, and Hermione all sort of like understand and know they need to do.
Yeah, a few things about that. It's interesting, too, to what extent Aberforth might then represent with his goat Patronus, not necessarily blindly rushing in, but blundering ahead, not maybe necessarily with the most elegant plan, and maybe two halves of the same coin. The idea that there's a time for theory and a time for action, sort of an Aristotelian thing going on there, if we continue to contrast them. And he, like Dumbledore, is also a psychopomp for getting somebody into the school, whereas, of course, Albus Dumbledore, in his name, one is invited to Hogwarts in the first place. It is Aberforth who leads one subterraneanly there through his bar. He also seems to hold a meeting place of the minds in the same way that Albus does, but again, in a more earthy fashion. But about Neville and the place that he seems to occupy or have occupied at Hogwarts during Harry's absence, a couple of things about that. One is, wow, it's really late in the year. I had no idea that they were past March. I think they said they were past some sort of break in the spring. I don't know if they said Easter yet. Two, the Carrows I thought were fairly interesting characters. But three, Neville seems to have really picked up Harry's slack while Harry's been gone. He seems to have really fit into the role of Harry. And so we've talked about him sort of being a stand-in for Harry, and J.K. Rowling explicitly making that connection when essentially Voldemort choosing to try and kill Harry made him the chosen one rather than Neville, who I suppose is the unchosen one then. I think it's very interesting that he really becomes Harry at the school in Harry's absence, though also maintains a deference for Harry, thinking we all knew you must have been up to something. And just on a personal note, if there were going to be a piece of literature that J.K. Rowling were going to write in addition to what she's already written, I'd be very interested in hearing from Neville, Ginny, and Luna's perspectives what that year without Harry, Ginny, and Ron, or excuse me, Harry, Hermione, and Ron was really like.
Yeah, that would be I'm sure there's a fan fiction out there, but that would be great to get from J.K. Rowling herself at some point. It's interesting to me that she kind of seems to be like going more along the lines of the kid who has magic and isn't like shown how to guide it and use it properly, right? That seems to be sort of first brought in with the character of Ariana, and that seems to be the real like idea or theme or whatever that she's most interested in kind of developing in all these the Fantastic Beasts series. That's like the big bad, right? The kid who just doesn't know how to control his powers and whose powers are sort of like turned inward or something. I forget the special name for that. But anyway, the whole story of like Neville and Ginny and Luna's year at Hogwarts here, that would be a cool like parallel, and I think it would have been really great if that story were told in place of a lot of what we get in this book. This book is a lot of like waiting around. Like, okay, I agree that's like important to see that aspect of like Harry's growth and sort of wrestling with that and having to be sort of patient, or rather just deal with his impatience or whatever it is that we're getting in a lot of this book. But like I think it could have been a way better story if we sort of moved a little bit more back and forth and we're in Hogwarts with other characters, and seeing things from their point of view. I feel like that would have been pretty doable and pretty rad, honestly. But this book, of course, it finishes strong.
That is interesting, though, to what extent this book is a story of denial, a story of negation, almost like, I would have to go back through and see whether there's more dark imagery than light imagery, but it's like we're denied the traditional Harry Potter narrative. We don't get to go to school. We don't get to see Quidditch. We don't get to go to class and meet our professors and the new professor for the new time. It's like it goes totally chaotic. It's as if it is itself Milton's sort of abyss in Book 2 of Paradise Lost. That and it does remind me quite a bit of the Return of the King and the Journey of Samwise and Frodo. That it's sort of grueling and long and less pleasant than the books before, and because it's missing things that made the story great. But I don't know what to do with that. Is that because this is the close of the book, that this is the night that comes to the day, that the pleasure of imagining a new world is now giving way to the actuality of the ending of the story? Perhaps also the reason so many Game of Thrones fans disliked the ending season of that story as well.
I mean, for my money, it's just like sort of a meandering plot in this one. Like, there's a lot of really good stuff, but there's also just like, I mean, I haven't read this one as much as the other ones, and maybe it'll grow on me if I read it more. But I just feel like I don't feel that urge to like keep reading, the way that is so powerful in all the other books in the series. So yeah, I mean, maybe that's intentional, and there's something she's kind of experimenting with there. But I just think, she kind of had a very complex story to tell in this book, and this is what she came up with. I'm not sure.
So I'll say something that just on as a counter argument. I'm not entirely sure that I buy this. And this is nothing against Neville West, because I do agree that he is quite something. But like you said, he picks up the mantle with Harry gone. But what he does, he and all of the other DA members, the kinds of resistance that they're engaged in, they wouldn't necessarily, I don't think that they'd be possible without the example of Harry to come before them. And I don't think that they are successful on their own, right? They are acts of sabotage, but they don't really seem to, they seem more like acts of childlike resistance. Not that they're childish, but just they don't seem directed at an end goal. And I think maybe you're right. I think we're right to point out that the seventh book is of a different character, for all the reasons that you listed. Chief among which is there are no teachers. And the teachers that they do encounter are Lupin, who Harry yells at, and Ollivander, who is terribly weakened, and Dumbledore, who is made imperfect at best, by virtue of his absence and rumors and all of that. But there are no teachers. There's no classroom, and yet I would argue that they learn just as much. Stumbling around in the dark, hit and miss at in Godric's Hollow, hit and miss at Malfoy Manor, and yet they're not. I don't know. They're not missing completely, because they are eliminating these Horcruxes. It seems like yes, it's a real deviation from the previous 6, but is that deviation, isn't that a valuable space to talk about what what happens when school ends, right? What kind of learning do you do in the world when maybe the stakes are higher, or maybe the stakes aren't higher, but just when you don't have teachers anymore? And they went a year early, right? So this isn't exactly normal graduation, but it does seem, I don't know. I think the kids who are still at Hogwarts, they have been waiting for Harry to come back. They're not, their resistance is not, is not, I don't know. I don't know that it would exist if it were not for Harry's example. I'm thinking of in schools when you have, well, this always seems to happen to me because I don't ever have good ideas. I'm just decent at executing things. But when someone vacates a post and you step in and you do everything that they did, you maybe do it a little bit differently, maybe a little bit more efficiently, but there isn't a lot of new, right? And there isn't a lot of I don't know if maybe I'm not articulating this well, but I feel like I see a difference in character that's not wholly bad. I like this book more maybe than book 6. So I think I just felt like the pattern of going back to school and going to Quidditch matches and going to class, I just felt like it was getting old. And it wasn't, I don't know, they needed a boost from the nest, but that could just be me.
Well, that's interesting, because then the chaotic element, like we've been talking about, if this is a story of Bildungsroman, of character formation, of the development of the young individual from adolescence to adulthood, and this last year is sort of when one gets placed out in the world and has to govern oneself by one's wits and one's learning and one's skills, alone, then it makes a lot of sense that it would be more meandering, less pre-packaged in the way that the others are. Also, I think there might be a symbol here for, well, you young generation have enjoyed the fruits of the older generations, but now you're responsible for producing them yourselves. And so you might have been very critical of how things were, but now look at this book where, the events are subject essentially to your will alone without an institution mitigating them. Look at all that's missing. You have to add all of this in. It doesn't just happen. And so I think there might also be sort of a comment on, and I think we did mention this a couple episodes ago, but just when one is put out on one's own for the first time, it is dark and scary, and without rules to how one uses one's time and energy being as set as they once were, especially if one were in Hogwarts and now one is, sort of operating between tents in the forest. There's going to be confusion. There's going to be a lot learned about oneself, but things are not going to be as organized or as perfectly executed as when you had master teachers teaching you within a space that was perfectly put together and assembled with all the objects necessary in order to convey lessons to you within a superstructure of more masters teaching other aspects of math, magic, within another superstructure of like the school and the magical governing body itself, making sure that this is all allowed for. It's as if we feel at each level of activity the lack of all of this, the lack of the teachers, the classroom, the school, and even the political superstructure that we can't even trust here. So it's as if things are less organized and less efficient, but in that way more revealing of, I guess, the people that they've actually become.
I've been thinking about the comparison with Return of the King. I think what I would say to that is just that there's a pretty clear goal, and maybe that's in both books, right? There's a clear goal in the sense that we know we have to destroy these objects. That's like the thing we have to do. But whereas in Tolkien's story, it's a very direct sort of like take the ring to the fire, right? It's like pretty straightforward in a sense. Here, it's way more vague, right? There's like a number of different objects. We don't know where they are. We don't know for a while how to destroy them. We don't even know if it's this class of mysterious objects, the Horcruxes, or the other class, the Hollows, that we should be chasing after for a little while there. And so there's these kind of episodes, and we've talked about this, right? You have these episodes of kind of clarity where it's like, okay, now this is the goal, like break into the ministry, get the locket, whatever. Break into Gringotts, get the cup, or whatever might be down there in the vault, because we don't actually know, right? But so there's like these kind of episodes where it's a clear goal that comes into view, and we go kind of clattering towards it for a little bit there, and then we've got to regroup. We're broken. We've got to come back together, and that's where I think it's helpful what you just said about like the nesting of stories within one another, because then you have this kind of larger story comprised of all 7 books, within which this one fits pretty nicely, actually, like as a counterweight. Yeah, like Sarah, you were saying, to all those 6 other books where they keep doing basically the same thing with some variations in each one, right? So this one has an interesting kind of relationship to its literary predecessor in Tolkien and to its more immediate, other books in the series, and the sort of way that it recapitulates these like mini quests within it is it gets the job done, I guess. I would have wanted, like as a reader, I would have wanted to jump back and forth a bit and not be stuck with Harry and Hermione and Ron the whole time, but like happens in Tolkien's books, we jump between, like half of the book is about Strider and Gandalf and what they're doing over there with Merry and Pippin, and then half of the book is about Frodo and Sam is just like the greatest, like maybe the only character in fantasy literature who's better than Neville is Sam and so that I can deal with, you know, some sort of boring parts in that half of the book, because, well, I miss more Neville in this book. I miss more Ginny in this book, and I'm that's all I'm really saying, I guess.
I understand.
I love that Neville's grandmother like is too much for the Death Eaters. I love that he is so effusive and proud of the fact that she's proud of him, and like I agree that it would have been great to kind of flash back and forth, but I don't know, there's something about, maybe at least for the reader, but also for Harry not knowing like what is the legacy, what kind of legacy did he leave at Hogwarts, like what, I think that him not knowing, that's almost more frightening, right? Like not knowing what kind of Hogwarts he's walking into, not knowing how much has changed or not changed without him. Like, you know, it might add, like the absence of us as readers knowing anything about the Hogwarts resistance, you know, #resist. Like if we know about it and Harry doesn't, I think it changes our level of like pity for him. But if we don't know about it, then we are as kind of like it amplifies the loneliness that he might feel. And again, like I'm with you, it would have been cool to hear about it, but I think that's why when he gets back into the room of requirement and he sees like all of the ways in which Neville has taken what he started and quite frankly made it better, right? Like Neville understands the room of requirement better than anyone. Neville's resistance is like pretty good, and he endures, you know, physical torture. He and somebody else, they like rescued other kids. Like my imagination is that it would be a pretty great story about like the Hogwarts resistance movement. But I feel like it's also really good for Harry to then come back and be like, oh shit, I wasn't the only one doing anything. Like, but also like what he has to do in resistance is of a fundamentally different character than what everybody else has to do. And I think that's also important for him to know, right? That like what the kind of resistance that Michael Corner can lift up, or even that Ginny or Ron or Hermione, like what is going to be asked of Harry is not of a degree, but of a kind different, right? Like they, like risking one's life versus giving one's life. Like that is, I don't know. I think that's part of what makes it so much more exciting when he comes back and he's like, oh, we're not at all alone in this. We never have been. And this reminds me that I need to go do my job, right? And not just like fall back into kind of the way that he might have resisted had he stayed at Hogwarts, had he never taken on this burdensome thing. I mean, we're sort of drifting from the reading, but I don't know. I don't know if that makes any sense, but
it makes a lot of sense. Go on, Wes.
No, I just, I think, yeah, once he's back, it is really striking how he has to kind of argue with them about what the right thing is to do next, and how he, I guess for their protection, right, still doesn't tell them, even though at this point Voldemort knows that Harry knows about the Horcruxes. Harry still doesn't tell anyone else who doesn't already know, right? And like he's going to keep doing that as his job alone, which I don't know, it's not impossible that somebody would have spotted, right, the hat hanging out on some, where is it? And it ends up being like on a bus or something there in the room of requirement somewhere. So he sort of doesn't give them the full story, but like continues going on his personal quest, right? While they're all like excited about fighting back, essentially. So I guess he does mention, right, like we need to find this diadem, but I don't know that is quite taking them into his confidence, right, and like getting their help on his job. They're
He
doing
doesn't
their own
even
thing.
he doesn't even tell Professor McGonagall, right? But as soon
Right.
as
Yeah.
as soon as he says I'm on orders from Dumbledore, she's like, oh well, man the battle stations. Like, we will take care. We will, right? Like, it's almost as though like him saying, I'm doing this thing. I can't tell you what it is, but at Dumbledore, it's like a code, right? Or like he said the magic word, and she's like, oh well, we will rise to the occasion and defend the castle militarily as best as we can while you do this thing that you haven't told me what it is, but it's like enough of a code to garner her trust in his like secrecy. But I love her. So the fact that she came back and was so like calm about with the Caros, and was also, P.S. could you guys, I think I would have been just every day annoyed if I had to solve a riddle in order to get into my goddamn dorm room at the Ravenclaw. That's it. That's proof alone that I do not belong in that house. But I don't know. I was like, I would never have been able to solve either one of those riddles in order to get into that dormitory.
Well, yeah, it's like you have to show that you're thinking about it, seems to be the main thing, though, right? Like neither of them gives like they're not the sort of thing that seems to have a single answer, I guess. Here's the thing I wanted to ask actually about like a weird continuity problem that I'm seeing here, like the use of the Imperio and Cruciatus curse by Harry and McGonagall here. Why do they get away with doing that without some sort of like consequence or anything? Like I guess Harry has to do it maybe, but it struck me, I guess, that they're using these curses all of a sudden, and that seems to be okay and like good.
I noticed that too, and what surprised me first was that Harry used the Crucio curse in front of McGonagall, and then that she used one too, the Imperio, I believe, right after him, and that she was so okay with that. I thought that was almost a breach in character of her, unless the other argument I saw for that is that when the government is corrupt, so are the laws that they enforce, and thus as those are the three unforgivable curses during a time of lawfulness, during a time of lawlessness, potentially there is no legitimate authority except for one's own judgment. And those curses, if the battle involves them, might well be used. I think Harry actually was given some guff about that when he was trying to escape with everybody looking like him with the Polyjuice potion, I think in book 6. That he was still using stunning spells, that he needed to use something with a little more and it was a little less characteristic of him. So those were the two ways I saw it. I saw that either as a breach, and it did strike me, Wes, or I just didn't understand whether maybe the laws were no longer considered just and no longer valid. And so that's why that could happen.
Or maybe no longer like laws, right? Like,
right.
Not that would make torture or taking away someone's free will like more or less ethical, just because they're more or less legal or illegal. But yeah, I too noticed that, and I felt like I didn't think it was out of character for Harry, but because he's used it before. But I did think that was out of character for McGonagall. She's always been sort of like a spirit and letter of the law kind of kind of person. But I don't know, maybe desperate times call for desperate measures. That seems really out of character, though, for her to even approach a situation like that. But
well, and we do certainly get to see another side of her with Pier Totem Locomotor, and it is funny to see her or hear her or read her say, "We teachers aren't quite good at magic, Mr. Potter." So I guess for next time we'll have to end this, and in this story, in this series, in this at least this iteration of this conversation, and end our time at school by breaking back into school, which I suppose we've just already done.
yeah.
Great. And this is a part you've been wanting to talk about, I think, from like one of the very first conversations. You brought up something that happens here in these last chapters. So
Oh my goodness, yes, my pet theory of all the theories I bring to the table, this is the one where I finally get to put this one to the test and see whether it survives the fires of y'all's intellects.
I don't even know what you're referring to, but I'm excited.
The great question of who should have died.
exactly.
Yes, and so I'm glad you brought that up, Wes. I'm very eager to revisit that, because I think I'll actually take the tact like Kobe Bryant joining the U.S. men's basketball team for the Olympics, where he said he was focusing on defense rather than shooting. I'll see if I can't pick some holes in my pet theory about that, and then present it a little more lucidly and less cryptically next time.
All right.
Interesting. Yeah. This sounds very cryptic. I will say what I said before, and not to like extend this project any more than either of you want, but I've already read the end, and I would be surprised if we needed only an hour to discuss all of the things. So maybe as we're reading, we can think about, like, do we want to do like a final reading part 1, a final reading part 2? If we think there's too much to do well in like one of these sessions, then that might be something we have to talk about off the air.
Okay. Okay.
Cool.
Yeah. Well, let's do it well. Since we've come so far.
All right. Happy birthday, Wes.
Happy birthday, Wes.
Thank you, guys. Thanks. It's been lovely. Have a good one.
Right.
Have some cake or something wonderful. Happy birthday. See you later.
See ya.
See ya. Bye.